They are
She
coming.
was the
The
invisible
guards will be
Maid,
here any
until
moment.
the
You have to
Alpha
leave
King
now.
walked into the
I will
wrong
not
room
run.
and saw her
Not
changing.
while there is still a chance to
Torches
fight.
flickered along the long corridors, casting shadows that danced like unseen spirits. In these halls, Alara moved as though she were nothing, a shadow among shadows, a presence unnoticed. She had always been invisible. Not by magic, at least not yet, but by the weight of the world that had trained people to ignore her. Alara's hands were nimble and quick. She dusted the corners, polished the marble floors, and straightened tapestries with a grace no one ever thanked her for. The nobles of the palace walked past her as if she were air, their laughter and voices washing over her without pause. She had long ago learned to embrace the solitude, to speak only when spoken to, and to never leave traces that might call attention to her existence. Yet even in invisibility, Alara noticed everything. The way the king's crown tilted slightly when he frowned, the way the queen's hands trembled when she feared a conspiracy, the way the guards whispered about secret passages and hidden treasures. She absorbed it all, knowing that her knowledge was a silent power she alone held. It was late when she found herself in the northern wing, a corridor she rarely entered. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and wax. As she adjusted a painting of a forgotten ancestor, she heard the faintest sound of approaching footsteps. Quickening her pace, she hoped to avoid notice. But tonight, fate had other plans. King Kalen entered the corridor, his presence as commanding as the legends had promised. Every step he took made the floorboards groan under his weight. His dark cloak flowed behind him like a river of shadows, and his eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the hall with the precision of a hawk. Most people in the palace gave him a wide berth. Few dared to meet his gaze. Alara's heart pounded, but she stayed still, blending into the shadow of a tall tapestry. Kalen's steps faltered. He was not searching for a maid nor for a servant. He was searching for a threat, something hidden in the corners of his palace, something that might destroy his reign. His lips tightened as he listened, as if he could hear the palace itself whispering secrets to him. And then he saw her. Alara, caught off guard, had stepped a little too far from the wall. Her sudden movement, a simple adjustment of her sleeve, was enough. Kalen's eyes, piercing and unforgiving, landed on her. For a moment, time seemed to shiver. She froze, a deer caught in the gaze of a predator. "Who's there?" Kalen's voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge of curiosity that surprised her. He was not angry, he was intrigued. Alara's voice trembled as she spoke, almost a whisper. "I am just cleaning, Your Majesty." Kalen's eyes narrowed, studying her. There was something in her stance, the way she held herself despite being so small and overlooked. She was invisible to others, but to him she seemed different, important, dangerous, even though she had no weapon. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, stepping closer. His boots made no sound on the polished floor, but every inch he approached felt like thunder in her chest. "This wing is forbidden." Alara bowed her head. "I know, Your Majesty. I needed to tidy the hall. I didn't mean to intrude." Kalen tilted his head, examining her as though he were trying to read a secret written across her very soul. "Most people would have hidden in fear," he said. "But you did not. Why?" Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. "Because I have nothing to hide." The king's lips curved in a shadow of a smile. It was the first expression she had ever seen on him that was not guarded, not distant. And yet it carried a weight, a sense of something unspoken and dangerous. Kalen turned his gaze away for a brief moment, and in that instant, Alara's thoughts drifted. She thought of the nights she had spent in silence, the days of being overlooked, the bitter sweetness of watching the world move around her while she remained unseen. She wondered what it was like to be noticed, not just glanced at, but truly seen. The sound of a door creaking made her start. She had forgotten for a moment that the king's steps were only part of the threat. Every hallway held secrets, every shadow could hide an enemy. She moved quickly, turning to leave, but Kalen's hand caught her wrist. "Wait," he said. His voice was softer now, almost hesitant. You don't have to run, Alara froze. I was not running, Your Majesty. Then stay, he said. I want to know who you are. She hesitated. To be seen by the king of all the kingdom, by the man whose eyes could pierce stone, was terrifying. And yet something in his tone made her pause. Not fear, but curiosity. Something she had not felt in years. I'm Alara, she whispered, the name tasting foreign on her own tongue. I serve the palace. And you serve well, Kaelin said, studying her again. But you are more than that, aren't you? Alara's pulse quickened. She had no answer. How could she explain the emptiness of invisibility, the loneliness of being ignored, the strange strength she had gathered in silence? Words failed her. Kaelin's eyes softened ever so slightly, but only for a heartbeat. There is a power in being unseen, he said. It is rare. Dangerous, I want to understand it. Before she could reply, a sound echoed down the corridor, a footstep that did not belong to them. Kaelin's body stiffened instantly, alert and commanding. He released her hand but did not move away. Someone is coming, he whispered. We must be cautious. Alara's heart pounded. She had never seen the king act with such instinctive fear. It was a reminder that he, too, was mortal, that even power had limits. She nodded, blending once more with the shadows, though now her invisibility felt different. She was no longer just a ghost in the palace. The king had seen her, truly seen her. They moved together, silent, as the footsteps drew closer. Every flicker of torchlight, every shifting shadow became a warning. Alara realized that despite all her years of unnoticed service, she had never felt more alive. And yet the danger that stalked the halls was real, a reminder that curiosity could be deadly. Finally, the sound passed. Kaelin exhaled slowly, his body relaxing, though the tension in the air remained. You have courage, he said quietly, and a strange strength. Alara's throat tightened. I've had too, she said simply. A silence settled between them, but it was not empty. It was heavy with unspoken thoughts, with possibilities neither dared voice. Kaelin turned to leave, and for a moment she thought he would vanish into the shadows and forget her. But he did not. Wait, he said again, almost reluctantly. Tomorrow you will join me in the council hall. There are things you must see, things you may understand better than anyone else. Alara blinked. The words felt like a summons from fate itself, a step into a world she had never dared enter. I will, Your Majesty, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Kaelin nodded once and moved away, his cloak flowing behind him like liquid night. Alara watched him disappear, her heart pounding with fear, wonder, and something else, something she could not name. She had lived her life in shadows, unnoticed, untouchable. And yet, for the first time, she felt seen. That night, as she returned to her small quarters, Alara could not sleep. Her mind replayed every detail. The weight of his gaze, the sharpness of his presence, the strange warmth that had stirred in her chest. For centuries, the palace had been her cage. Now it felt like the first step toward freedom, or perhaps something far more dangerous. The palace slept around her, but its walls whispered secrets of old. Curses, betrayals, and ancient power lingered in the corridors. Alara shivered, not from cold, but from the realization that her life and her heart had just been irrevocably altered. Tomorrow she would walk into the council hall, under the watchful eyes of the Alpha King. She did not yet understand what that meant, nor the cost it would bring. But she knew one thing: she would never be invisible again. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the palace, something stirred, a force awakened by the union of courage and curiosity, a darkness that had waited centuries for a spark. Alara did not know it yet. But the moment Kaelin had seen her, destiny had begun to turn. The morning sun barely touched the palace walls when Alara stepped into the council hall. Its vast chamber was colder than she expected, echoing with the weight of history. Tall stone pillars stretched upward, disappearing into shadows that no light could reach. The air smelled of parchment, wax, and a faint trace of lavender, the king's personal incense, meant to sharpen the mind and dull fear. Alara's hands were steady, though her heart raced. She had walked these halls countless times, cleaning, observing, and silently moving through the lives of others. But today was different. Today, she walked with the knowledge that Kalen, the Alpha King himself, had seen her, truly seen her. The council hall's doors opened before she could reach them. Kalen was already there, seated at the head of the long, polished table. His cloak draped over the chair like liquid shadow, and his dark eyes flicked toward her, sharp as a blade. "Enter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. It was not a greeting. It was an order, yet laced with curiosity. Alara stepped forward, her hands folded in front of her. She felt exposed, almost painfully aware of her own presence, yet something in Kalen's gaze made her feel less like a servant and more like someone who mattered. "You are late," Kalen said, though his tone carried no anger, just observation. "I apologize, Your Majesty," she said, bowing slightly. I wanted to prepare myself." Kalen's lips curved in the smallest shadow of a smile. "Preparation is wise. Courage is rarer." The room fell silent as Kalen began to speak to the other nobles present. Alara stayed at the far end of the hall, blending into the shadow of a pillar. But no matter how much she tried to disappear, she could feel Kalen's gaze upon her like a steady flame, warm and impossible to ignore. The discussion began with matters of the kingdom, troop movements, harvests, and whispers of rebellion in the borderlands. Alara listened carefully, absorbing every detail. She had long practiced silence, but now she realized her knowledge could serve a greater purpose. If she spoke, she could guide, warn, even protect, but her voice was fragile and the court was unforgiving. Finally, Kalen's sharp eyes found her again. "You have been here longer than a servant should," he said softly, almost to himself. "What do you see?" Alara hesitated. To speak would draw attention, yet she sensed an opportunity. I hear things," she said quietly. "I notice things others miss." Kalen studied her, his expression unreadable. "And what do you notice now?" she swallowed, finding courage in the quiet weight of the hall. "That some of our counselors speak of loyalty, but their eyes tell a different story. They fear, and yet they plot. The kingdom is not as safe as we believe." The room's murmurs shifted, but no one dared challenge her. Nobles were not used to being observed by someone invisible. Kalen's eyes darkened, sharp with calculation. "Interesting," he said, "and useful." Alara felt a flicker of pride mixed with fear. She had stepped beyond her station, yet the king's approval felt like sunlight breaking through the shadows of her life. After the council ended, Kalen motioned for her to follow him into a smaller chamber, a study lined with ancient books and scrolls. The air smelled of old parchment and candle wax. A single window let in a narrow beam of sunlight, illuminating dust motes that floated like tiny spirits in the air. "Sit," Kalen commanded, though it was more invitation than order. Alara obeyed, perching on the edge of a carved chair. Her hands twisted in her lap as Kalen moved to a nearby table, picking up a small, leather-bound book. He flipped through its pages, his fingers brushing the parchment like he feared breaking a secret. "You know," he said finally, not looking at her, "few notice what is hidden. Most see only what they are told to see. You notice everything." "I have always had to," Alara said softly. "When you are unseen, the world becomes a collection of whispers and shadows. You learn to listen, to understand, because no one else will." Kalen's eyes lifted, meeting hers. For a moment the room felt smaller, warmer, and yet charged with an invisible current. "And what do you want, Alara?" She blinked, caught off guard. I don't know," she admitted. "I have never been asked." "Then perhaps you will tell me," Kalen said. His voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath it. "I want someone who can see the truth, someone who will stand with me, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as someone who matters. Can you do that?" Alara's chest tightened. She had always dreamed of being seen, of mattering, yet the thought of standing beside a king filled her with fear. I will try, Your Majesty," she said finally. Kalen nodded once, satisfied, though his eyes betrayed the lingering weight of doubt. "We shall see," he said. "But the world outside these walls is not forgiving. Courage alone may not be enough." That night, the palace seemed different to Alara. She moved through the corridors, carrying her usual tasks, yet now she felt noticed. She heard whispers behind closed doors and caught the fearful glances of nobles who sensed something shifting. But more than anything, she felt Kalen's presence in her mind, like a shadow she could not escape, yet did not wish to. As she reached the northern wing again, a cold wind blew through a cracked window, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and something older, something powerful. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch, as if alive, whispering secrets only she could hear. Alara froze. She had learned to trust her instincts, and now they screamed at her. Something was coming, something that even Kalen might not see in time. A sudden noise startled her, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffling from the darkness. She crouched low, pressing herself against the wall. The shadows seemed to gather, and a chill ran down her spine. She felt an unseen presence, a consciousness that watched her with patient curiosity. "You are awake," a voice whispered. It was neither male nor female, yet it carried authority. "You who have been invisible, you are ready to see." Alara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to escape into the safe corridors of her familiar life. Yet something drew her forward, curiosity stronger than fear. Who are you?" she asked. "A guardian," the voice replied, "and a watcher. The palace holds more than stone and flame. It holds power hidden for centuries, power that stirs now, awakened by the presence of one who is both shadow and light." Alara's mind raced. Could this be connected to her curse? To the feeling she had always carried that she was not quite like other people? "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "Only to guide," the voice said. "But know this, your path is tied to the king, the one who sees you, the one who awakens you. And yet your fates may bring fire or they may bring ruin. Choose wisely, little shadow." The hallway fell silent. Alara pressed her hands to her chest, heart hammering. The air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. She realized then that she had been standing on the edge of a world she had never imagined, one of secrets, power, and danger that reached far beyond the palace walls. The next day, Kalen summoned her again. This time he led her to the training yard, where soldiers sparred and practiced with swords and shields. The clang of steel rang sharply, echoing in the open air. He walked beside her, his dark cloak trailing behind him, and said, "You must learn to move with purpose, not fear. Invisibility alone will not save you." Alara tried to mimic the soldier's movements, though her body was untrained. Kalen watched her closely, correcting her stance, adjusting her grip, and guiding her with patience she had not expected. Each touch was brief, professional, yet electric, leaving a warmth that lingered long after he stepped away. "You have courage," he said finally as they paused. "But courage without skill is fragile. You must balance both." Alara nodded, feeling both pride and anxiety. She had always been strong in silence, but now she understood that her invisibility was not enough. The world she had entered demanded more. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the palace, Alara returned to her quarters. She felt the weight of knowledge, of responsibility, and of something new, a bond forming with the king, one that neither could yet name. And somewhere in the darkness, the unseen force stirred again. It was patient, watching, waiting for the moment when courage, curiosity, and destiny would collide. Alara did not know the trials to come. She did not know the shadows that would test her, nor the truths she would uncover. But she felt, deep in her bones, that her life, and the kingdom itself, was about to change forever. The palace seemed to breathe with a life of its own as night fell. Shadows crept along the walls like living things, curling in corners and stretching across the polished floors. Alara walked through the hallways, her footsteps soft, yet her heart thumped like a drum. Each sound seemed amplified in the silence, as if the very walls were listening to her. She had changed. The king's attention had shifted something inside her, a spark that had long slept. For the first time in her life she felt seen, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as someone whose existence carried weight. And yet that recognition brought fear as well. To be noticed by the Alpha King was to be both protected and exposed. Kaelin awaited her in the northern wing, near the secret library of the palace. The room was dim, lit only by a few candles whose flames flickered against ancient tomes and scrolls. The scent of parchment, dust, and incense lingered in the air, a mixture both comforting and unsettling. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair beside a low table. His cloak pooled around him like a dark river. The sharpness in his eyes softened just slightly when he looked at her. Alara obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. "Your Majesty," she said, though her voice lacked the usual tremor of fear. "You are learning," he remarked, his tone quiet but firm. "And yet there is more to know. The palace, the kingdom, it holds secrets that even I do not fully understand." Alara's eyes widened. "Even you," she whispered. "The king," Kaelin inclined his head. "Even me. Power is not always knowledge, and knowledge is not always power. There are forces in this palace, older than the walls themselves, forces that awaken when they sense courage or curiosity." Alara's fingers twitched at the edge of the table. She thought of the voice she had heard in the northern hallway days ago, the guardian who spoke of unseen power. Could it be true? Could the palace itself hold something alive, waiting for her? Kaelin noticed her gaze, sharp and penetrating. "You have felt it," he said. "The air shifts around you, does it not?" Alara nodded. "Yes, sometimes it feels alive, like it watches me." "Then you are ready," he said. His voice was calm, but the weight of it pressed on her chest. "Ready for what comes next." He handed her a small scroll, sealed with the king's personal insignia. "This is a record of the old wards," he explained. "Spells, protections, and warnings placed centuries ago. Some of them still work. Some have been corrupted." Alara carefully unrolled the parchment, eyes scanning the faded script. The language was unfamiliar, yet somehow she could sense its meaning. Her fingers tingled as if the words themselves were alive, humming with energy beneath her touch. "Do you understand it?" Kaelin asked. I think I can," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is a pattern, a rhythm." Kaelin nodded approvingly. "Good, you will need that skill. The palace is not safe. There are those who would use its power for destruction. And there are shadows that cannot be fought with swords alone." Alara's mind raced. She had lived her life in silence, unseen, yet now she stood at the edge of forces that dwarfed her imagination. And standing beside her was the king, fierce, commanding, yet showing a patience she had never expected. Days passed and their lessons continued. Kaelin taught her to observe not just the people, but the spaces they inhabited, the halls, the chambers, the gardens, and the hidden corridors. He trained her to notice the smallest detail, the flicker of a candle that betrayed a secret meeting, the faint trail of dust that revealed a hidden passage, the slight tension in a guard's shoulders that suggested loyalty had a price. And through it all, a bond began to grow. Neither fully acknowledged it, not yet, but each glance, each brush of the hand when adjusting her stance, each moment spent in shared silence carried an unspoken intimacy. One evening, Kaelin took her to the palace gardens. Moonlight spilled across the stone paths, illuminating the petals of night-blooming flowers. The air was cool, scented with jasmine and wet earth. "Do you feel it?" Kaelin asked, stopping near a fountain whose water glimmered like silver under the moon. Alara nodded. "The palace, it watches, and yet it seems calmer here. Because this garden is a place of balance," Kaelin explained. "Shadow and light, danger and peace. It is rare in a kingdom where power dominates." Alara's heart quickened as he stepped closer. He did not touch her, not yet, but his presence pressed against her like a warm wind. "You are changing," he said softly, "stronger, more certain, and yet still cautious." "I have always been cautious," she replied. It is how I survive." He studied her closely. "And yet now you choose to step forward to be seen. That choice makes you more dangerous than you know." Alara swallowed. "Dangerous? I do not wish to be dangerous." "Sometimes," Kalen said, "danger is the only way to grow." Their eyes locked. In the moonlight, the garden seemed suspended, a world outside time, a place where words could not fully capture the currents flowing between them. And for a moment, neither moved, each aware of the power they could awaken in the other, strength, trust, and something tender, dangerous, and undeniable. A rustle of leaves snapped them from the moment. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a noble from the court, face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Your Majesty," the visitor said, voice trembling, it's the northern wing. The wards, they are failing. Something moves inside unseen. I do not know how to stop it." Kalen's expression darkened. He turned to Alara, his eyes sharp with urgency. "This is your test. You will go with me." Alara's stomach tightened. She had never faced danger like this, not in the quiet corners of the palace, not in the moonlit gardens. And yet the pull she felt toward Kalen, the trust forming in the brief moments of connection, gave her courage. She followed him through the corridors, her senses heightened. Shadows seemed to cling to the walls, and the air smelled of smoke and old stone. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind, felt like a warning. The northern wing was darker than she had ever seen it. The torches flickered and threatened to go out entirely. As they approached the forbidden chamber, a cold wind swept through the hall, carrying a whisper of voices that were not quite human. Kalen drew his sword, the blade catching the torchlight, and gestured for her to stay close. "Do not be afraid," he said, "but be alert. The palace will test you, and so will the shadows." Alara's hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from anticipation. She had always been invisible, always protected by her unnoticed presence. Now she had to confront the unknown, and she was not alone. They entered the chamber. The walls were lined with mirrors that reflected the candlelight in strange, flickering patterns. Shadows moved along the edges, almost as if the mirrors themselves were alive. In the center of the room was a figure, cloaked and shifting, its form hard to define. Kalen stepped forward. "Reveal yourself," he commanded. The figure's voice was a hiss, echoing strangely through the chamber. "You are not ready," it said. "Neither of you. The girl, she is tied to the palace, to the blood, and yet she is fragile." Alara felt a chill run through her. Fragile. She had never felt fragile. She had survived unseen for years. And now the force before her recognized something in her that even she was just beginning to understand. "You underestimate her," Kalen said, his voice sharp. "And that will be your mistake." The figure retreated into the shadows, leaving a whisper. "Soon, the palace will demand a price, and she will be tested." Alara's hands shook, but her resolve hardened. She met Kalen's gaze, and he nodded once, as if to say, "We face this together." The chamber seemed to pulse with the echoes of the encounter. The shadows retreated, but the weight of the warning lingered. Alara realized that her life, and her connection to the king, was no longer confined to quiet corridors and unnoticed service. The palace itself had awakened, and she had a role she could not escape. Walking back through the corridors, Kalen remained close. He did not speak, but his presence was a shield and a promise. Alara's heart beat rapidly, aware that every step they took together bound them closer, even as danger waited in the corners of their world. As she returned to her quarters, the moonlight spilling over the palace walls, Alara knew one truth: her life had changed forever. She was no longer invisible, and the shadows of the palace, ancient and patient, were watching her, waiting for the moment she would either rise or fall. The palace awoke to a strange quiet, heavier than the usual stillness of dawn. Even the wind seemed to hesitate as it moved through the corridors, and the torches flickered as if uncertain of their purpose. Alara stood in the northern wing, her hands pressed together, feeling the pulse of the palace beneath her feet. She was no longer the invisible maid. She was something stronger now, a guardian, a witness, and a participant in a fate she had never imagined. Kalen entered quietly, as though his presence alone could steady the restless air. His dark eyes swept over her, sharp and alert, yet soft with the unspoken bond they now shared. "The palace feels alive today," he said quietly. "More aware and angry," Alara nodded. "It is not just the palace, it is the force we encountered yesterday. It will test us. And it will demand a price." Kalen's jaw tightened. "Then we face it together." His hand hovered near hers, not touching, but the promise was clear. They were allies in every sense, bound by courage, by trust, and by the strange power that had begun to grow between them. The first signs came at midday. Shadows moved along the walls, faster than any wind could carry them, stretching and twisting into shapes that were almost human. Doors that had been locked for centuries groaned and opened on their own. And from the hidden corridors, whispers reached Alara's ears, voices she could not recognize, yet felt intimately tied to the palace's ancient memory. "Are you ready?" Kalen asked, his hand brushing hers lightly as he led her through the corridors. The contact was brief yet electric, and it filled her with a courage she had not known she possessed. Alara swallowed. "I am." They entered the central hall where the air itself seemed to shimmer. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked and shifting, its presence oppressive. It was the same force they had faced before, yet stronger, more deliberate. Its eyes, dark and endless, seemed to pierce into their souls. "You walk boldly," the figure said, voice like wind over stone. "Little shadow, and yet the king trusts you. That will be your undoing or your salvation." Kalen drew his sword, its blade catching the flickering torchlight. "I do not underestimate her," he said. "She is not fragile and she is not alone." Alara felt a strange heat in her chest. The words, though brief, carried the weight of trust and faith, something she had never experienced before. Her invisibility, her silence, her years of unnoticed service had prepared her for observation, for endurance. But this was different. This was participation, action, and courage made real. "You will fail," the shadow hissed. "The palace does not forgive." Kalen stepped forward, holding the sword before him, but his eyes were fixed on Alara. "We are not afraid," he said. Alara focused, feeling the pulse of the palace beneath her hands and feet. She remembered the scrolls, the wards, the patterns of old magic. The guardians of the palace had always waited for someone who could see, who could act, who could connect courage with wisdom. Now she understood. She was that someone. With a breath, she extended her hands toward the shadow, feeling the energy hum in her palms. The ancient force recoiled slightly, surprised by her boldness. "You are stronger than I expected," it hissed. Alara met its gaze steadily. "We do not fight alone," she said. And with emotion learned through instinct and study, she traced a circle in the air, activating the wards she had memorized. The air shimmered, forming protective glyphs around them both. The shadow shrieked, a sound that shook the walls but could not break through the barrier. Kalen's sword struck with precision, forcing the force into retreat but not defeat. The chamber trembled as it vanished into the shadows, leaving a whisper. "The final choice awaits. One will rise, the other will fall." Alara sank to her knees briefly, chest heaving. She had faced the darkness and it had recoiled. But the warning lingered. The palace demanded more, not just courage but understanding, trust, and sacrifice. Kalen knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did well," he said quietly, "more than I could have hoped." Alara looked up at him, her chest still pounding. "I could not have done it without you." "And I could not have done it without you," he said. His gaze softened, lingering, heavy with unspoken truths. For a moment the world seemed to pause. The shadows, the danger, the weight of destiny, they all fell away, leaving only the connection between them. The days that followed were tense, yet transformative. Together they combed the palace, reinforcing wards, uncovering hidden passages, and confronting remnants of ancient magic. Every step they took side by side deepened their bond. Each touch, each shared glance, carried more than professional necessity. It carried trust, understanding, and the beginnings of something deeper. One evening in the palace gardens under the full moon, Kalen spoke again. "The palace tests more than strength," he said, his voice low and steady. "It tests heart, loyalty, and the ability to face truth." Alara looked at him, her own heart echoing his words. "And what truth must we face?" she asked. "The truth of ourselves," he replied. "Of what we value, of what we fear, and of what we are willing to risk for the ones we trust." The words hung in the air, heavy and electric. Alara felt the weight of the palace's power, the shadow's warnings, and the unspoken bond between them. She realized that courage alone was not enough. They needed each other, not just to survive, but to rise above the shadows that sought to consume them. The final test came with the breaking of dawn. The palace trembled, ancient wards failing as the shadows attempted one last assault. Figures moved through the halls, whispers rising to a roar. Alara and Kalen faced the central chamber together, knowing that the moment had come. Alara stepped forward, hands raised, feeling the energy of the palace respond to her. Kalen placed his hand over hers, a connection both grounding and empowering. Together, they traced the final circle, activating the wards with precision, courage, and trust. The shadows screamed, twisting and writhing, but the power of unity, of courage and understanding held firm. "You are stronger than the palace believed," the shadows hissed, fading into the void. "Stronger than the king himself." Alara's knees trembled, but she remained steady, the wards glowing brighter as the shadows retreated. Kalen lowered his sword, eyes never leaving hers. "You are remarkable," he said softly. The chamber fell silent, the weight of centuries of danger lifting. The palace, though still ancient and mysterious, seemed lighter, calmer. The unseen forces that had lingered for so long now bowed, acknowledging her strength and courage. Alara exhaled, finally allowing herself to feel relief, pride, and something more. She looked at Kalen, and in that moment words were unnecessary. The bond forged in fear, danger, and trust spoke louder than any language. Kalen stepped closer, the distance between them closing. His hand reached out, brushing her hair from her face, and his eyes held a depth of admiration, respect, and something tender. "You are no longer invisible," he said quietly. "Not to me, not to the palace, not to yourself." Alara smiled, a soft, trembling expression that carried years of silence, isolation, and finally recognition. "I am not," she said, "and I will not be." The palace itself seemed to exhale, the shadows retreating to the corners, leaving light to touch the walls. They stood together, side by side, no longer master and servant, no longer shadow and observer, but equals, bound by courage, trust, and the trials they had faced together. Days later, the palace returned to its routine, but something had shifted. Alara moved through the halls not as an invisible maid, but as a guardian of its secrets, trusted by the king and recognized by the forces that had long lingered unseen. Kalen observed her with pride and a quiet affection, both aware of the bond that had grown from danger, shared courage, and the quiet power of understanding. The palace had demanded a price, as the shadows had warned. Yet the cost had not been pain alone, it had been transformation. Both Kalen and Alara had grown, learning that strength came not from dominance or invisibility, but from trust, courage, and the willingness to face fear together. And in the quiet moments when the torches flickered and the palace hummed softly with ancient magic, they would sometimes meet in the corridors, exchange a glance, a touch, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. Neither needed words. The trials had spoken for them. Alara had stepped from shadows into light, from silence into recognition. Kalen had learned that true strength was tempered with trust, and that courage could be found in the most unexpected places. Together they had faced the unseen, conquered the dangerous, and found in each other a force that no shadow could touch. The palace, ancient and alive, whispered in quiet approval. Its secrets were safe, its wards strengthened, and its guardians chosen. And at the heart of it, in the echoing halls and moonlit gardens, two souls stood united, ready to face whatever destiny still waited beyond the walls, hand in hand, hearts aligned. The invisible maid had become a force of light and courage. And the Alpha King had found someone who could match him, not in title alone, but in heart, in spirit, and in unyielding bravery.